This story highlights the dangers of discrimination black people may face when dining at restaurants, showcasing an elderly black man who endures racist behavior from a waiter. The lesson urges caution and preparedness, advocating awareness of possible prejudice in public spaces. The sun dipped low in the Texas sky, casting a golden glow over the small town. The Lone Star Diner, nestled at the corner of Main Street and Maple, was alive with the sounds of sizzling grills, clinking dishes, and the murmur of conversations. It was the kind of place where regulars knew each other by name and newcomers were greeted with a smile, or at least, that's how it was supposed to be. Mr. Henry Jackson walked through the front door, the bell above announcing his entrance with a cheerful chime. At 73, his steps were slower now, a slight limp in his left leg that told stories of a long life lived with both hardship and resilience. He wore a faded blue button-down shirt, neatly tucked into his slacks, and a well-worn hat that shaded his weathered face. His eyes, though tired, carried a kindness that had endured through the years. As he took in the sight of the busy diner, filled with families laughing and couples enjoying their meals, he felt a sense of nostalgia. The Lone Star Diner had been around for decades, and it reminded him of the places he used to visit as a young man. He chose a table by the window, away from the crowd, where he could watch the evening light fade and enjoy a quiet meal. Across the room, James McCarthy was busy rushing from table to table, taking orders, and serving plates with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. In his late 20s, James had a rugged, clean-cut appearance, short, neatly combed hair and a pressed uniform that suggested he took pride in his job. But beneath the surface, there was an edge to him, a sharpness in his eyes that hinted at judgment. He noticed Mr. Jackson taking a seat, and a scowl flickered across his face. "Great, just what I need," James muttered under his breath. He glanced around the room, making a point to avoid eye contact with Mr. Jackson. To him, the sight of the elderly black man, alone and out of place in a predominantly white establishment, was enough to set off his prejudices. He'd grown up in this small town, absorbing the stereotypes and attitudes passed down through generations. And while he rarely spoke openly about his views, they showed in his actions. Linda, the older waitress, caught the look on James's face and frowned. She'd worked at the Lone Star Diner for over 15 years and had seen every kind of customer walk through those doors. She knew James well enough to sense when he was in one of his moods, and the way he looked at Mr. Jackson sent a shiver down her spine. "James, table 4 needs a menu," she called out, her voice firm but gentle. James glanced at the table, pretending not to hear her. Instead, he moved on to the next group of customers, smiling as he greeted a young couple with enthusiasm. Linda's eyes narrowed, and she shook her head. She knew she couldn't force James to do his job the right way, but she wasn't about to let Mr. Jackson go unattended. With a sigh, Linda grabbed a menu from the counter and made her way over to the window table. "Good evening, sir," she said warmly, placing the menu in front of Mr. Jackson. "I apologize for the wait. It's quite busy tonight." Mr. Jackson looked up, a gentle smile spreading across his face. "No problem at all, ma'am. I appreciate your kindness." She smiled back, grateful for his patience. "Take your time, and when you're ready, just wave me over. I'll make sure you're taken care of." As Linda walked away, she threw another look in James's direction. He was serving another table, all smiles and charm, but when his eyes met hers, he quickly turned away. Linda felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew all too well that some people couldn't see past the color of a person's skin, and while she had tried over the years to educate James and others like him, she also knew that change was slow, and sometimes it never came. Mr. Jackson, unaware of the quiet tension building in the diner, took his time with the menu. He wasn't in a hurry. He rarely was these days. He watched the people around him, appreciating the warmth and the bustle of life. It reminded him of the days when he and his late wife used to visit places like this, savoring the simple pleasures of good food and good company. After a few moments, he decided on a bowl of chili and some cornbread, something simple and comforting. He raised his hand to get someone's attention, but before Linda could respond, James beat her to it. Reluctantly, James approached the table. "What can I get for you?" he asked, his tone flat, his eyes avoiding Mr. Jackson's. Mr. Jackson, still smiling, placed his order. "I'll have the chili and cornbread, and a sweet tea if you don't mind." James jotted down the order without looking up. "Sure," he muttered before walking away. He headed to the kitchen, where he slapped the ticket down on the counter. The cook, a burly man named Joe, raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He'd learned long ago that when James was in one of his moods, it was best to stay out of it. Back at the table, Mr. Jackson waited patiently. It took longer than usual for his food to arrive, and when it did, it was Linda who brought it out, her smile bright but her eyes apologetic. "Here you go, sir," she said, setting the plate and the tea in front of him. "Let me know if there's anything else you need." Mr. Jackson thanked her, but as she walked away, he couldn't help but notice the look of concern on her face. He wondered if it had anything to do with the young waiter, who seemed distant and cold. Mr. Jackson had seen that look before, in countless other places, and he knew better than to take it personally. Still, it stung a little. As Mr. Jackson ate, he felt eyes on him. James, busy at another table, would occasionally glance his way, a sneer pulling at his lips. Mr. Jackson continued to eat quietly, ignoring the stares and focusing on the food. The chili was warm and hearty, and the cornbread had just the right amount of sweetness, a taste that brought back memories of his mother's cooking. But as he sipped his sweet tea, he noticed it wasn't as sweet as he remembered. It was watered down, almost as if someone had done it intentionally. He sighed but didn't say anything. He'd learned long ago that complaining about such things often led to worse. Linda noticed Mr. Jackson's expression and felt her frustration grow. She watched as James continued his rounds, making every effort to serve other tables while ignoring Mr. Jackson. She knew she had to step in, but she also knew that it wasn't her place to discipline him. That would be up to Alex, the owner's son, who was due to arrive any moment. As Mr. Jackson finished his meal, he caught Linda's eye and gave her a nod of appreciation. She approached his table with a check, hoping to offer a small kindness. "Your meal's on the house tonight, sir," she said softly. "It's the least we can do." Mr. Jackson's eyes softened, and he smiled. "That's very generous of you, ma'am. Thank you." As he reached for his wallet to leave a tip, the bell above the door chimed again. Alex walked in, his eyes scanning the room. He spotted Linda and gave her a nod, but his gaze lingered on Mr. Jackson. There was a moment of recognition in his eyes, but he said nothing as he watched the scene unfold. The Lone Star Diner was reaching its peak evening rush. The clatter of plates and the hum of conversation filled the air, but amidst the lively chatter, there was an undercurrent of tension. Alex, the owner's son, leaned casually against the counter, pretending to scan the menu but really watching the interactions in the room. He had spotted Mr. Jackson, a familiar face he hadn't seen in years, and something about James's demeanor didn't sit right with him. Mr. Jackson, having finished his meal, sat patiently as he waited for his dessert order, a slice of peach cobbler. Linda had already taken the order, but James intercepted it, a frown darkening his face as he grabbed the ticket. "I'll take this one," he said curtly, moving past Linda without waiting for a response. Linda's eyes followed him, her concern deepening. She had seen James's behavior toward Mr. Jackson escalate from passive avoidance to outright disrespect, and it was getting harder to stand by. She caught Alex's eye across the room, and their silent exchange spoke volumes. He gave her a nod, as if to say, "I've got this." Linda sighed, relieved that Alex was aware of the situation. James emerged from the kitchen a few minutes later, balancing the plate with the cobbler and a dollop of vanilla ice cream. As he approached Mr. Jackson's table, his steps slowed, and his expression hardened. He set the plate down roughly, causing the ice cream to slide slightly. The sound of the plate hitting the table was loud enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby customers. "There you go," James said, his tone lacking any warmth. "Enjoy." Mr. Jackson looked up, offering a polite smile despite the rough handling. "Thank you, young man," he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. But James, not satisfied with his subtle display of disdain, leaned in slightly, his voice dropping low so that only Mr. Jackson could hear. "You know, some folks might think you're out of place here," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. Mr. Jackson met James's gaze, the smile fading from his face. He remained silent for a moment, as if weighing his response. Finally, he spoke, his voice even. "I've been in a lot of places where people thought I didn't belong. Doesn't bother me much anymore." James scoffed, shaking his head. "Sure, old-timer. Keep telling yourself that." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, a satisfied smirk creeping across his lips. From across the room, Alex's eyes had been fixed on the exchange. He saw the way James leaned in, the tightening of Mr. Jackson's expression, and the smugness that lingered on James's face as he walked away. Something in Alex's chest tightened. He knew this diner represented his family, his legacy, and he wouldn't allow anyone to tarnish it with bigotry. He made his way over to Mr. Jackson's table, pulling out the chair across from him. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" he asked, smiling. Mr. Jackson's face lit up with recognition. "Well, I'll be Alex Thompson. I thought that was you." He extended a hand, and Alex shook it warmly. "It's been a long time, Mr. Jackson," Alex said, sitting down. "It's good to see you." "Likewise, son. I used to visit your father's place years ago. It's nice to see you've taken over the family business." Alex nodded, his smile genuine. "I've been trying to carry on the tradition, but I've got a long way to go." His eyes flicked toward the counter where James was chatting with another waitress. "Seems like I've got some work to do." Mr. Jackson followed his gaze but didn't say anything. Instead, he cut into his cobbler, taking a bite. "This cobbler is as good as I remember," he said, changing the subject. Alex smiled, but there was a hint of tension behind his eyes. "I'm glad you're enjoying it." He paused, his tone shifting to one of concern. "I hope everything else has been satisfactory tonight." Mr. Jackson met his eyes, understanding the unspoken question. "You know, Alex, I've been around a long time. Seen a lot of things. Some folks still got a lot to learn, but I've learned not to let it get under my skin." Alex nodded, a serious look on his face. "I appreciate your patience, Mr. Jackson. But if there's ever an issue, I want to know about it." Mr. Jackson's eyes twinkled, and he leaned back in his chair. "Don't you worry about me. I've been through worse than an ornery waiter." Meanwhile, James continued to serve tables, his eyes occasionally darting back to Mr. Jackson and Alex. He saw them talking and felt a prickle of irritation. Who did this old man think he was, cozying up to another customer like they were long-lost friends? And why was Alex wasting his time with him? As Alex and Mr. Jackson talked, James decided he'd had enough. He walked over, forcing a polite smile. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his tone not quite matching the expression on his face. Alex looked up at James, studying him for a moment. "Actually, everything's fine. I was just catching up with Mr. Jackson here. He's an old friend of the family." James's expression faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, is that so?" He glanced at Mr. Jackson, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "Well, if you need anything else, just let me know." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away. As James walked back toward the kitchen, Alex watched him go, the tension building in his chest. Something needed to be done, but he didn't want to cause a scene, at least, not yet. He turned back to Mr. Jackson, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry about that, Mr. Jackson," Alex said quietly. "He doesn't seem to understand that we treat everyone who walks through those doors with respect." Mr. Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "It's not your fault, son. You can't control what's in a person's heart. All you can do is try to set them straight." Alex sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "You're right, and I plan to. Thank you for your understanding." The night went on, and while Mr. Jackson finished his meal, Alex continued to observe James's behavior from a distance. He noticed the way James's mood seemed to sour whenever he passed Mr. Jackson's table, the way he served other customers with a smile but seemed unable, or unwilling, to extend the same courtesy to Mr. Jackson. Alex decided it was time to test James. He walked over to the counter and placed an order himself, a second slice of cobbler, this time with a note to deliver it to Mr. Jackson's table on the house. James, seeing the order come through, frowned but reluctantly prepared it. He approached the table, holding the plate with barely concealed irritation. "Here's your dessert, courtesy of the management," he said flatly, placing it down with a thud. Mr. Jackson glanced up at James, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Thank you, young man." James gave a forced smile, his eyes flicking to Alex, who stood watching a few feet away. "Anything else?" "Not at the moment," Mr. Jackson replied, his tone polite. But I appreciate the gesture. James nodded curtly and walked away. But as he did, he muttered under his breath, "Must be nice to get special treatment." Alex's eyes darkened. He'd heard enough. It was one thing for James to be rude, but the blatant disrespect, even when Alex had explicitly told him to treat Mr. Jackson well, was unacceptable. As James reached the counter, Alex intercepted him. "I need a word with you," Alex said, his voice low but firm. James, looking surprised and a bit nervous, nodded. "Sure, what's up?" Alex gestured toward the back room. "Let's talk privately." James's eyes darted around the diner, and for a moment, he looked like he wanted to refuse. But he knew better. He followed Alex, feeling a knot of unease tighten in his stomach as he disappeared through the door. Outside, the evening continued as usual, but inside the Lone Star Diner, things were about to change. The door to the back room swung shut behind them, the noise of the bustling diner fading into a muffled hum. The back room was small, lined with shelves stacked with supplies, cleaning equipment, and a bulletin board covered in schedules and notices. The air felt heavier here, and James could feel the tension rising as he faced Alex, the owner's son. Alex crossed his arms, leaning against one of the shelves. His eyes bore into James, and the silence hung thick in the air for a moment. "What's going on out there, James?" Alex asked, his tone calm but firm. James shifted his weight from one foot to the other, avoiding Alex's gaze. "I'm not sure what you mean," he replied, trying to sound casual, but the tightness in his voice betrayed him. Alex tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "I think you know exactly what I mean. I've been watching you tonight. The way you've been treating Mr. Jackson, my family's friend, isn't acceptable." James bristled, a hint of defiance creeping into his eyes. "I've been doing my job, Alex. If he feels like he's not getting special treatment, that's not my problem." "Special treatment?" Alex repeated, his voice growing colder. "I asked you to serve him the same as you would any other customer. You're supposed to make everyone feel welcome here, but instead, you've gone out of your way to make him uncomfortable." James clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling over. "Look, I don't get why he's so important. Just because he's your family's friend doesn't mean—" "Stop right there." Alex's voice was sharp, cutting James off. "This isn't about him being my family's friend. It's about how you treat people. Plain and simple. It's not up for debate." James's face reddened, and he crossed his arms defensively. "Well, maybe I'm tired of people walking in here expecting handouts, acting like they own the place." Alex's eyes narrowed. "Is that what you think? That Mr. Jackson is here for a handout?" He shook his head, the disappointment clear in his eyes. "He's a paying customer, just like everyone else. And even if he wasn't, it's our job to show everyone the same respect." The room fell silent again, the tension crackling in the air. James's bravado seemed to fade, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He opened his mouth as if to argue but then shut it, his eyes darting around the small room. "Look," Alex continued, his tone softening slightly but still firm. "I know what it's like in this town. I grew up here, too. But this diner, it's supposed to be different. My family built this place to be a space where everyone feels welcome, no matter who they are or where they come from." James looked down, his arms still crossed but his expression less defiant. "I get that, but," he paused, searching for the right words. "It's not easy to change what you've been taught your whole life." Alex sighed, some of the anger leaving his face. "I know it's not easy, James. But that's no excuse. This job, this place, demands better. And if you can't show every customer the respect they deserve, then you don't belong here." James's eyes flicked up, a hint of panic creeping into his voice. "You're not firing me, are you?" "I should," Alex replied, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "But I'm going to give you one last chance." He held up a hand before James could respond. "If I see or hear anything like this again, if you disrespect another customer the way you did tonight, you're done. No second chances." James swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. "I understand," he said quietly, his bravado gone. Alex stared at him for a moment longer, making sure the message had sunk in. "I hope you do," he said finally. "Because this is your final warning. Now get back out there and finish your shift. And make sure Mr. Jackson has everything he needs." James nodded, his face set in a grim expression. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the bustling diner, his steps heavy. Alex watched him go, his own expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. As James returned to the front, he forced a neutral expression onto his face, but his eyes remained downcast. He busied himself with clearing tables and taking orders, his interactions with customers now robotic and devoid of the usual charm he displayed. He knew Alex was watching, and for the rest of the shift, he made sure to avoid any further incidents. Meanwhile, Alex returned to Mr. Jackson's table, his demeanor shifting back to one of warmth. "I apologize for the delay, Mr. Jackson. I hope everything has been all right." Mr. Jackson smiled, his eyes kind as he looked up at Alex. "Don't you worry about me, son. I'm just glad to see you're keeping the place running like your father did." Alex's face softened. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson. That means a lot." He hesitated, then added, "And I appreciate your patience tonight." Mr. Jackson gave a slight nod, as if he understood. "You know, Alex, sometimes folks just need a little guidance. It's not easy changing how you see the world." Alex nodded slowly, grateful for Mr. Jackson's understanding. "You're right. But that doesn't mean it's not worth the effort." Just then, Linda appeared at the table, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She filled Mr. Jackson's cup and gave Alex a reassuring smile. "Everything okay here?" Alex smiled back. "Yes, everything's fine. Thanks, Linda." As the night went on, the diner gradually quieted down. Customers began to leave, and the once bustling space took on a more peaceful, relaxed atmosphere. Mr. Jackson stayed a little longer, enjoying his coffee as the staff cleaned up around him. When he finally stood to leave, Alex insisted on walking him to the door. "It was good seeing you, Mr. Jackson. Don't be a stranger, all right?" Mr. Jackson smiled, tipping his hat. "I won't, son. Take care of yourself." As Mr. Jackson walked out into the cool Texas night, Alex watched him go, a sense of resolve building within him. He knew that there was still work to be done, not just with James but with others who might walk through those doors. But if he could make even a small difference, it would be worth it. Back inside, James continued to clean up, keeping his head down. Alex noticed the tension in his posture, the way he moved with an air of uncertainty. He hoped the conversation they'd had would be enough to make James rethink his behavior. But deep down, Alex knew this was only the beginning. Some lessons took time, and not everyone was willing to learn. He could only hope that James was one of the ones who would. As the Lone Star Diner wound down for the night, the mood shifted to one of quiet reflection. The tables were mostly empty now, with only a few regulars lingering over their coffee. The bright hum of conversation had faded to a murmur, and the staff began the familiar routine of closing up, wiping down tables, stacking chairs, and sweeping the floor. James moved slowly, a troubled look etched on his face. The conversation with Alex had rattled him more than he cared to admit. He knew he'd crossed a line, but deep down, part of him was still defiant, clinging to the attitudes he had grown up with. As he wiped down a table, he watched Alex and Linda chatting at the counter, their heads close as they talked. He knew they were discussing him, he could feel it, and the thought made his blood boil. Linda, glancing over her shoulder at James, sighed and turned back to Alex. "You did the right thing, Alex. He needs to understand that we're not going to tolerate that kind of behavior." Alex nodded, but his expression was clouded. "I know, but it's hard. I want to give people chances, you know? But there's only so much patience I can have. My dad always said that this place was about making people feel welcome, and I can't let one person ruin that." Linda smiled, a hint of pride in her eyes. "Your father would be proud of you for standing up for what's right. But you know as well as I do, some people take longer to change." As they spoke, the doorbell chimed again, and a group of young people walked in, college students by the looks of them, full of energy and laughter. They took a seat at a booth near the back, their voices echoing through the quiet space. James took a deep breath and forced himself to approach their table. He needed to show Alex that he could be professional, that he could do his job without letting his personal feelings get in the way. As he took their orders, he pasted on a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Meanwhile, Alex watched closely, noticing the effort James was putting in. It was a small step, but it was something. Maybe, he thought, there was still hope. Just as things seemed to settle, the door swung open once more, and a man walked in. Alex's face lit up as he recognized the newcomer, his father, Samuel Thompson. Samuel had built the Lone Star Diner from the ground up, and although he had stepped back to let Alex take over, he still visited regularly to check in and catch up with the regulars. "Dad," Alex called out, waving him over. Samuel grinned, his face crinkling with the warmth of familiarity. "Hey, kiddo. How's business tonight?" "Busy as usual," Alex replied, shaking his father's hand before pulling him into a hug. "We had a bit of a situation, but we're working through it." Samuel's eyes flicked around the diner, landing briefly on James, who was now delivering drinks to the college students. "Everything all right?" Alex hesitated, then sighed. "We had a customer, an old friend of yours, Mr. Jackson, and James didn't exactly give him the welcome he deserved." Samuel's face hardened. "Henry Jackson? That man's been a friend of this family for longer than most of these walls have been standing." He glanced sharply at James, who was making his way back to the kitchen. "And James was disrespectful?" Alex nodded. "I talked to him. Gave him a warning. I'm trying to give him a chance, but I'm not sure he gets it." Samuel rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Sometimes, a warning isn't enough. People need to be shown the impact of their actions." He paused, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Maybe there's a way to get through to him." At that moment, Linda, who had been listening quietly, joined the conversation. Henry was gracious about it, like always. But he shouldn't have to be. She turned to Alex. "Your father's right. Maybe there's something more we can do." Alex nodded slowly, the wheels in his mind turning. "I think you're right. It's one thing to tell someone they're wrong, but it's another to show them why." He glanced at the kitchen door, where James had disappeared, and then looked back at his father. "I have an idea." As the last customers filtered out, and the clock inched closer to closing time, Alex called James back into the dining area. The tension from earlier had cooled, but it still hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. "James, can you come here for a second?" Alex asked, his tone neutral. James wiped his hands on a towel, a wary look in his eyes as he walked over. "What's up?" "I wanted to give you a chance to make things right," Alex said. "Mr. Jackson is a good man, and he's been a friend of this family for a long time. He came in tonight, expecting to enjoy a quiet meal, but he was treated unfairly." James's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. "Tomorrow, we're hosting a community event, an appreciation dinner for our long-time customers," Alex continued. "Mr. Jackson will be one of our guests of honor. I want you to be there, to personally serve him and make amends." James blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You want me to serve him again? After tonight?" "That's right," Alex said firmly. "But this time, I want you to do it with respect. Show him the courtesy you should have shown tonight. This is your chance to make it right. Otherwise, we're going to have to part ways." James felt the weight of Alex's words. It wasn't just a second chance, it was his last chance. "Okay," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I'll be there." "Good." Alex's expression softened slightly. "I believe in second chances, James. But you have to earn them." With that, James nodded and walked back into the kitchen, his mind swirling. He knew he had messed up, but he wasn't sure how he felt about apologizing, let alone serving Mr. Jackson again. Still, he knew that if he wanted to keep his job, he had no other choice. The next evening, the Lone Star Diner was transformed. Long tables were set up with white cloths, and the smell of barbecue and cornbread wafted through the air. Balloons and streamers hung from the ceiling, and the room buzzed with excitement as customers, old and new, filled the space. James stood at the front, a tray in his hand, as he watched people trickle in. He felt out of place, unsure of himself. He wasn't used to community events. He had always seen them as pointless. But tonight was different. He was here to prove himself, and he could feel the eyes of Alex, Linda, and even Samuel watching his every move. When Mr. Jackson arrived, dressed in his best Sunday suit. James's heart pounded in his chest. He watched as Alex greeted him warmly, then led him to his seat at the head of the table. The older man's face was as kind as ever, showing no hint of resentment or anger. This, for some reason, made James feel worse. Alex gestured for James to come over. "James, why don't you take Mr. Jackson's order?" James approached, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze on him. "Good evening, Mr. Jackson," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Can I get you something to drink?" Mr. Jackson looked up at him, his expression neutral but kind. "Sweet tea, if you don't mind, young man." James nodded and walked back to the kitchen, his hands trembling. He poured the tea carefully, making sure it was perfect this time, no watered-down mess. When he returned, he placed it gently in front of Mr. Jackson, and for the first time, he met the man's eyes. James paused, struggling to find the words. "I want to apologize for the way I treated you last night. It wasn't right, and it won't happen again." Mr. Jackson's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. "Thank you, son. I appreciate that." He lifted his glass, taking a sip. "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do afterward." James felt a knot loosen in his chest. For the first time, he felt like maybe he could change, that maybe it wasn't too late. He continued to serve Mr. Jackson and the other guests throughout the evening, and though he stumbled a few times, he felt something shift inside him. The small acts of service, the smiles from customers, and the feeling of being part of something bigger began to change the way he viewed the diner and his role in it. As the night drew to a close, Alex approached James, a small smile on his face. "You did good tonight," he said. "Keep it up, and you'll earn your place here." James smiled, a genuine one this time. "Thanks, Alex. I appreciate the chance." The warm evening air hung over the Lone Star Diner as the community event drew to a close. Customers lingered, chatting and laughing as they finished their meals and began to make their way out. The hum of conversation and the sounds of chairs scraping against the floor filled the room, giving it a sense of life and connection that Alex loved to see. James, still carrying a tray and wiping down tables, felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The night had gone smoothly, and though he had felt like an outsider at the start, he now felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in a long while, he sensed he might belong here, if he was willing to put in the work. As he made his way back to the kitchen, he saw Mr. Jackson standing by the door, his hat in his hand and a warm smile on his face as he spoke with Alex and Samuel. It was clear they had known each other for years, and the sight of their easy camaraderie made James pause. For a moment, he was an observer, watching the kind of connection he had always felt on the outside of. Samuel glanced over and spotted James lingering near the kitchen door. "James, come on over," he called, waving him forward. James hesitated, but he took a deep breath and walked over. "Yes, Mr. Thompson?" Samuel smiled. "We were just talking about the old days, back when Mr. Jackson and I first started coming to this place. You know, Henry here was one of our first customers." Mr. Jackson chuckled softly. "And I've seen a lot of good people come through these doors since then. Some of them stayed, and some moved on, but this place always felt like home." James felt a pang of guilt, realizing how much the diner truly meant to Mr. Jackson. "I didn't know that," he said quietly. "I guess I've been too caught up in my own world." Mr. Jackson's eyes twinkled. "You're not the only one, son. But the important thing is you're trying. That's more than most." James looked down, feeling the weight of the older man's words. "I am trying. And I know I have a lot to learn." Alex nodded approvingly. "Learning is a good start, James. But it's also about doing. This diner has always been about building community, about treating people like family, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. If you want to be a part of that, you've got to carry that spirit with you." James felt the sincerity in Alex's words, and it hit him harder than he expected. "I get that now," he said, his voice steady. "I want to be better." Mr. Jackson put a hand on James's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "We all have our battles, son. And the best way to overcome them is to face them head-on." As the last of the customers trickled out, Linda approached, giving James an encouraging smile. "You did well tonight, James. I'm proud of you." James managed a small smile. "Thanks, Linda. I still have a lot to work on. Don't we all? She said with a wink. But you're on the right path. The following week, Alex implemented a new program at the diner: community service and volunteer opportunities for the staff. The idea was to have the employees engage with the broader community and help out at local events. It was a way to foster the spirit of togetherness that the diner had always been about, and it was also a test for James. One Saturday morning, Alex called James into his office. I signed us up for a volunteer event this weekend, he said, his tone casual but his eyes serious. It's a community cleanup project at the park. I want you to join me and Mr. Jackson. James blinked in surprise. Mr. Jackson is going to be there? Alex nodded. He's been a volunteer for years. He believes in giving back, and I think it'll be a good opportunity for you to see how he lives out those values. James agreed, though he felt a knot of nervousness in his stomach. He still felt awkward around Mr. Jackson, knowing how poorly he'd treated him. But he also saw it as a chance to prove that he was serious about changing. When Saturday morning arrived, James showed up at the park early, dressed in an old t-shirt and jeans. He spotted Alex and Mr. Jackson setting up supplies, gloves, trash bags, and shovels, and made his way over, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. Mr. Jackson greeted him with a warm smile. Glad to see you, James. We've got a lot of work to do today. James smiled back, grateful for the older man's kindness. I'm ready to help. For the next few hours, James worked alongside Alex and Mr. Jackson, picking up trash, planting flowers, and helping rebuild a bench that had fallen into disrepair. At first, he felt out of place, unsure of how to act, but as he watched Mr. Jackson interact with the other volunteers, laughing, sharing stories, and working with an energy that belied his age, James felt a sense of admiration. It was clear that Mr. Jackson was more than just a regular at the diner. He was a pillar of the community. During a break, James and Mr. Jackson found themselves working side by side, clearing weeds from a patch of grass. James hesitated before speaking. Mr. Jackson, I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night. Mr. Jackson glanced at him, his expression encouraging. And what have you been thinking, son? James paused, choosing his words carefully. I've realized I was wrong about a lot of things. About how I treated you and about the way I've seen people in general. He let out a sigh. I know I still have a long way to go, but I want to change. Mr. Jackson nodded thoughtfully. It's a big step to admit that, James. And an even bigger one to do something about it. He pulled out a weed and tossed it aside. The good thing is, you're young. You've got time to grow and become the man you want to be. James felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Jackson. I appreciate you giving me another chance. Mr. Jackson smiled. I believe in second chances. We all need one at some point. As the weeks passed, James continued to volunteer with Mr. Jackson and Alex. They worked at food banks, organized charity drives, and even set up a reading program for kids at the local library. Slowly, James began to see the impact these small acts of kindness had on people's lives, and it changed him. The more he got involved, the more he understood the values Alex and his father had built the diner upon. He started interacting with the customers differently, greeting everyone with a smile and making an effort to learn their names. The regulars began to warm up to him, and even Linda, who had been skeptical at first, saw the changes and offered her support. One evening, as James was cleaning up after another busy shift, Alex pulled him aside. You've come a long way, James. I've noticed the effort you've been putting in, and so have the customers. James felt a swell of pride. Thanks, Alex. I'm just trying to live up to what this place stands for. Alex grinned. And you're doing a great job. I'm glad you're part of the team. James nodded, feeling for the first time that he truly belonged. As he looked around the diner, seeing the familiar faces and hearing the sounds of laughter and conversation, he knew he had found his place. The Lone Star Diner had become a second home for James. As he continued to work and volunteer, he found himself more deeply involved in the community, and with each passing day, he felt the weight of his old prejudices lift. The diner, once just a place where he clocked in and out, had become a place where he felt a sense of belonging. He was learning the names and stories of the regulars, making connections, and building relationships that transcended the transactional nature of his job. It was early on a Saturday morning when Alex called the staff together for a meeting. The diner was quiet, the chairs still up on the tables, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air. Linda, Samuel, and a few other waitresses gathered around as Alex stood behind the counter, his hands resting on the wood as he smiled at them. "Morning, everyone," Alex began. "I wanted to let you all know that tonight we're hosting a special community dinner, a sort of thank you for all the support over the years. We're inviting everyone who's been a part of the diner's story, from our regulars to folks who volunteered with us." There was a murmur of excitement among the staff. The Lone Star Diner's community events were always lively, filled with laughter, music, and, of course, plenty of food. "And," Alex continued, "I have something special planned. Tonight, I want James to share a few words about his experience volunteering and how this place has changed his perspective." James, who had been listening quietly from the back of the group, felt his stomach drop. All eyes turned toward him, and he forced a smile, feeling the pressure of the spotlight. "Wait me," he asked, his voice tinged with nervousness. Alex nodded. "Yes, you've come a long way, James, and I think it's important for people to hear your story. It's a testament to the growth we're all capable of." Linda patted James on the back, smiling warmly. "You've got this, James. Just speak from the heart." James hesitated, a mixture of anxiety and determination swirling inside him. He wasn't used to public speaking, let alone sharing his personal journey with a crowd. But he also knew this was an opportunity to show the community, and himself, that he had truly changed. He nodded, finding his voice. "Okay, I'll do it." That evening, the Lone Star Diner was filled with life. Tables were pushed together to form long rows, and the air buzzed with the chatter of old friends and new faces alike. Strings of lights hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the room. The smell of barbecued ribs, cornbread, and peach cobbler wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the scent of fresh flowers arranged in vases along the tables. James moved through the crowd, serving plates and refilling drinks, but his mind was on the speech he would soon have to give. He had rehearsed it in his head all day, but now, standing amidst the people he had once felt disconnected from, he worried that his words wouldn't be enough. Alex clapped his hands to get everyone's attention, and the room gradually quieted. "I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight," he began, smiling at the crowd. "This diner has been a part of this community for decades, and it's because of all of you that we're still here." Applause filled the room, and Alex gestured for James to step forward. "Tonight, I'd like one of our team members to say a few words. James has been working with us for a while, and he's made an incredible journey, not just here at the diner but within our community." "James." James felt his heart race as he stepped forward, the faces of the diners, some familiar, some not, turning toward him. He cleared his throat, gripping the microphone tightly. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice wavering slightly. I'm James. Most of you know me as the waiter who's been serving you for a while now." A few people in the crowd chuckled, and the friendly response gave him a little boost of confidence. "I want to be honest with you all tonight," he continued. "When I first started here, I didn't see this place for what it truly is. I didn't understand the kind of community it represented. I had my own ideas that weren't fair or right. And truthfully, I didn't treat everyone the way they deserved to be treated." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But over the past few months, working with Alex, Linda, Mr. Thompson, and volunteering with Mr. Jackson and others, I've learned what it means to be part of something bigger. I've seen how this diner brings people together, how it's more than just a place to eat. It's a place where people connect, share stories, and support each other." Mr. Jackson, standing near the front of the room, smiled encouragingly. James met his eyes, feeling the sincerity of his own words. "Mr. Jackson, I owe you a lot. You gave me a chance to learn and grow, even when I didn't deserve it. And I want to thank you for that." There was a hush in the room, and James felt a surge of emotion. "I've learned that it's never too late to change, and it's never too late to make things right. I hope I can keep earning my place here, and I'm grateful to be part of this community." Applause erupted, and James felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. Alex clapped him on the back as he stepped away, and Linda gave him a thumbs up from across the room. Mr. Jackson raised his glass, a gesture of solidarity that brought a smile to James's face. After the speech, The night continued with music and laughter. The sense of unity was palpable as people shared meals and stories, bridging the gaps that had once divided them. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew he still had work to do, but he finally felt like he was on the right path. As the evening wound down, Alex and James stood side by side, watching as the last of the guests departed. The diner was quiet again, the air filled with the soft hum of the overhead lights. "You did good tonight," Alex said, his voice filled with pride. "I meant what I said earlier. You've come a long way." James smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment he had never felt before. "Thanks, Alex. I owe a lot of that to you, and to Mr. Jackson." Alex nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to give you a chance." Mr. Jackson, who had stayed behind to help clean up, approached them. "Well said, Alex." He turned to James, his eyes twinkling. "And remember, James, the journey doesn't end here. Every day is an opportunity to build something better." James nodded. "I know. And I'm ready." The three of them shared a moment of quiet understanding, knowing that while the road ahead might not always be easy, it was one worth traveling together. The Lone Star Diner had always been a place where people found not just food but connection, and now, James truly felt like he was a part of that legacy. As they turned off the lights and locked up for the night, James walked out with Alex and Mr. Jackson, feeling a sense of belonging and purpose that filled him with hope for the future. The stars shone brightly above, and for the first time, James felt at peace. In the months that followed, the diner continued to thrive, and James became a central part of its community events and volunteer programs. He worked alongside Alex, Linda, and Mr. Jackson, building relationships that went beyond the walls of the diner. One day, as he stood behind the counter, greeting the regulars and newcomers with a genuine smile, he felt a sense of pride in the place he once saw as just a job. It had become his home, and the people, his family. The Lone Star Diner's mission of bringing people together, regardless of their background, lived on. And James, once a skeptic, had become a true believer in the power of community and the possibility of change. The Lone Star Diner had become more than just a restaurant for James. It was a place where he had transformed, and in turn, he saw the potential it had to transform others. In the months that followed his speech at the community dinner, he noticed the subtle ways his actions, and those of the diner's team, began to create a ripple effect throughout the town. The lessons he had learned and the change he experienced started to impact not only him but the people around him. One day, as James and Alex sat at the counter after another busy lunch shift, Alex shared a new idea he'd been working on. "James, I've been thinking about starting an outreach program," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "We've got so many regulars and community members who come here, and I think we could do more to give back." James's interest piqued. "What kind of outreach are you thinking?" "Well, I was thinking of expanding our volunteer work. We could partner with the local high school and get students involved in community service projects, cleanups, food drives, that sort of thing. Maybe even a mentorship program." James felt a surge of excitement. "That's a great idea. I'd love to be part of that." Alex smiled. "I knew you would. And I want you to take a lead role. You've proven that you're committed to the community, and I think you could be a great example for others, especially for the younger generation." James hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility, but then he nodded. "I'd be honored. Let's do it." The outreach program launched a few weeks later. They called it Bridging the Gap, and it quickly became a hit. Students from the local high school signed up, eager to earn volunteer hours and make a difference. James led the projects, working closely with the students and encouraging them to engage with the community. One Saturday, the team organized a food drive at the diner. Mr. Jackson, as always, was present, and he and James worked side by side to collect donations, pack food boxes, and distribute meals to families in need. The students who volunteered watched as Mr. Jackson and James coordinated the event with a sense of purpose and camaraderie. During a break, one of the students, a young black teenager named Malik, approached James. "Mr. James, can I ask you something?" James, surprised by the Mr. title, chuckled. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Malik hesitated, looking down at his feet before meeting James's eyes. "I've been volunteering here for a while now, and I've seen how everyone respects you. I want to be like that, but it's hard sometimes, you know?" James nodded, understanding the unspoken struggles behind Malik's words. I get it, Malik. I used to struggle with how I saw myself and others too. But the thing I've learned is that respect starts with how you treat people, no matter who they are or where they come from. Malik seemed to think about this for a moment. I guess I've got a lot to learn. James smiled warmly. We all do. But you're already on the right path, just by being here and putting in the effort. Mr. Jackson, overhearing the conversation, joined in. And remember, Malik, change doesn't happen overnight. But every small step you take is part of building something bigger. You've got a lot of potential. Malik's face lit up with a grin, and he nodded. Thanks, Mr. Jackson. Thanks, Mr. James. James felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known before. The chance to be a mentor and make a difference in someone else's life felt like a continuation of the growth he himself had experienced. The work they were doing was no longer just about him. It was about fostering the kind of community that had welcomed him when he needed it most. Despite the success of the outreach program, not everything was easy. Some people in town still harbored old prejudices, and there were moments when James faced resistance, both from those who knew his past and from others who didn't believe in the diner's mission. One afternoon, during a planning meeting for a town cleanup event, James overheard a couple of volunteers murmuring behind his back. "Can you believe they have him in charge?" one of them whispered. "I remember when he used to be the rudest guy here." Another person added, "Yeah, people like him don't change. They're just pretending." The word stung, but James took a deep breath, reminding himself that real change took time and patience. He knew he couldn't control how others viewed him, but he could control his response. He approached the volunteers with a calm smile. "Hey, I understand if you have doubts about me," he said, surprising them. "I know I made a lot of mistakes in the past, and I don't expect people to forget that. But I'm here because I want to do better, for myself and for the community." The volunteers exchanged looks, and one of them softened. "I guess we all have things we regret," they admitted. "It's good to see someone trying to make up for it." James smiled, relieved. "I appreciate that. Let's focus on making this event a success together." As they worked side by side, James felt the tension ease. Slowly but surely, he was earning back trust, one person at a time. As the one-year anniversary of Bridging the Gap approached, Alex and the team decided to host a celebration at the diner. It would be a way to recognize the volunteers and community members who had supported their efforts over the past year. James took the lead in organizing the event, coordinating with local businesses to donate food and supplies. On the night of the celebration, the diner was packed with people: students, families, and longtime customers. There was music, laughter, and a sense of shared accomplishment in the air. Alex, Linda, and Samuel beamed as they watched the event unfold, proud of the impact their diner continued to have on the town. James stood at the front, ready to give another speech. He still felt a twinge of nerves, but this time, there was also a sense of confidence. He had found his voice. "Good evening, everyone," he began, the crowd quieting as he spoke. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This program wouldn't be possible without each of you, without your hard work, your dedication, and your belief in what we're building together." He paused, glancing at Mr. Jackson, who smiled encouragingly from his seat. "A year ago, I didn't know where I fit in this community. I struggled with my own prejudices, and I had to learn the hard way that real growth takes effort. But the people here, Alex, Mr. Jackson, Linda, and all of you, showed me that it's possible to change. And I want to thank you for that." There was a ripple of applause, and James felt a swell of pride. This diner has always been about bringing people together, and I'm grateful to be part of that mission. I hope that as we move forward, we can continue to build something that bridges divides and brings our community closer. As the applause grew louder, James felt a sense of fulfillment and belonging. He had not only found his place but had helped others find theirs too. The Lone Star Diner had become a beacon of unity, and he was proud to be a part of its legacy. Months later, as the diner continued to thrive, Alex decided to expand the business. He planned to open a second location in a neighboring town, and he offered James the opportunity to manage it. James was stunned. "Me? Are you sure?" Alex grinned. "Absolutely. You've proven yourself, James. You've earned the trust of this community, and I can't think of anyone better to carry our mission forward." James accepted the offer with a mixture of excitement and gratitude. As he prepared for the opening of the new location, he knew he had found his calling. The work he was doing was no longer just about redemption. It was about building bridges, fostering community, and creating a space where everyone felt they belonged. The new diner opened its doors to the same warmth and hospitality as the original Lone Star Diner. And as James stood behind the counter, welcoming customers with a smile, he felt a deep sense of purpose. He had come full circle, from a man lost in his own prejudices to someone who helped others find their way. The ripple effect of change continued, and with each new day, James was ready to play his part in building a community where everyone had a place at the table.